In March 2026, about 400,000 metric tons of premium Basmati rice were stranded at Indian ports or stuck mid-voyage in the Arabian Sea. A single choke point failure did what bad harvests usually do. It froze trade flow overnight. The immediate shock was logistical, but the deeper risk was nutritional. When premium rice cannot move, entire food systems start repricing. This market is not small. It is a roughly $36 billion global trade, linked to more than 2 billion people who rely on rice for up to 80% of daily calories. The choke point at the center is only about 48 kilometers wide. Ship arrivals through the Strait of Hormuz fell about 93% year-on-year during the disruption window. Because around 70% of India's Basmati exports pass through that gateway, there was no functional backup route. To understand why exposure is this extreme, follow 3 threads. First, where Basmati can actually be grown. Second, where demand is concentrated. Third, which maritime corridors connect those 2 geographies. Basmati is not interchangeable with generic rice. Commercial production is geographically locked to the Indo-Gangetic plains across northern India and eastern Pakistan. No other region has scaled authentic supply at comparable commercial volume. India dominates global exports, but that dominance sits on a narrow ecological base. Geography gives quality and creates fragility at the same time. India accounts for roughly 65% to 85% of global Basmati exports. Core production zones include Haryana, Punjab, Western Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistan supplies the remaining 15% to 35%, heavily centered around Hafizabad district in Punjab province. So the crop starts from concentration even before shipping begins. There is no broad global production fallback. Demand concentration mirrors supply concentration. Roughly 60% to 72% of India's Basmati exports go to the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is the largest single buyer at up to $2 billion a year. Iraq follows near $950 million through government tender channels. This is not a globally balanced buyer map. Iran adds volatility on top of concentration. Its Basmati intake has swung between about $698 million and $1.5 billion, largely shaped by sanctions and currency stress. Jebel Ali in the UAE functions as both a consumption market and a key re-export node. Europe still imports around $2.13 billion in total rice, and the US around $1.61 billion. But the highest dependency sits in the Gulf-facing corridor. That corridor runs through western Indian ports, such as Kandla, Mundra, and Pipavav, plus Karachi in Pakistan. Cargo then crosses the Arabian Sea and funnels through Hormuz. If that lane closes, trade does not reroute smoothly. It stalls. Over the last 2 decades, that exact stall has repeated under different triggers. The trigger changes, the fragility stays. The modern template appeared in the 2008 global rice crisis. India banned non-Basmati exports and imposed a Basmati minimum export price between $1,000 and $1,200 per ton. Vietnam, Egypt, Cambodia, and Pakistan introduced additional restrictions. Panic buying followed, even though global inventories were physically adequate. Between January and May, benchmark rice prices rose more than 300%. That episode normalized policy as a market weapon. The same pattern returned from 2022 to 2024 under war risk and El Niño fear. In September 2022, India banned 100% broken rice exports and added a 20% duty on non-Basmati grades. In July 2023, it escalated to a full ban on non-Basmati white rice exports. Markets then had to reprice policy shock, not crop failure alone. At the time, India controlled roughly 40% of global rice trade. The 2023 decision removed an estimated 15% of world supply overnight. Thai benchmark prices jumped more than 20% within weeks and reached 15-year highs. In August 2023, India also imposed a Basmati MEP at $1,200 per metric ton to curb smuggling via misclassified customs codes. Estimated welfare damage reached about $1.7 billion, including around $315 million in annual consumer surplus loss. Then, policy reversed rapidly. By late 2024, a record monsoon produced about 142 million metric tons of rice, and buffer stocks overflowed. India removed restrictions it had previously tightened. In October 2024, all MEP constraints on Basmati and non-Basmati were removed. Market structure flipped in the opposite direction. 5% broken white rice fell from about $425 per ton to around $351. That cheaper flow hit competing exporters hard. Vietnam's shipments to Ivory Coast dropped around 68.5%. Thai benchmark prices slid to about $347 per ton, the lowest since 2017. Thai export volume fell about 24% overall. Pakistan had benefited while India was tightening. In December 2025, Pakistani exporters shipped about 489,000 tons in 1 month. That temporarily pushed Pakistan ahead of Vietnam as the world's third-largest exporter. UAE purchases alone were close to 75,000 tons in that period. Momentum looked strong, but it did not hold. After India reopened, Pakistan removed its own price floors to compete. By April 2025, Basmati exports reportedly fell to about 43,895 tons. The collapse coincided with Iran border closure and protests on the Indus Highway that disrupted trucking routes. Trade stress came from both external policy and domestic logistics. The export system lost resilience on both fronts. A deeper structural shift also emerged inside production zones. Subsidized solar tube wells pushed many growers toward higher-yield, non-Basmati varieties that are more water-intensive. Some lots of Kenta were sold fraudulently as Basmati in Central Asian and African markets. That damages price trust while accelerating groundwater depletion. Quality integrity and resource sustainability are now linked risks. Regulatory signals reflected that deterioration. In 2024, the EU blocked 104 rice consignments from Pakistan. Reported reasons included pesticide residue exceedances and aflatoxin concerns. Quality failures then become market access failures. Over time, those failures compound currency and logistics stress. Now step back to maritime architecture. About 55% of globally traded maize, wheat, rice, and soybean passes through at least one major choke point. Basmati's route depends on two of the most volatile, Bab el-Mandeb and Hormuz. When one corridor destabilizes, freight can still reroute. When both destabilize, buffer capacity disappears fast. That dual stress started in late 2023 with Red Sea attacks. Houthi operations drove sustained risk escalation on commercial shipping. Suez container transits dropped about 50%. Carriers rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope almost immediately. Transit assumptions had to be rewritten in real time. Rerouting added roughly 3,500 to 4,000 nautical miles and about 10 to 15 extra days per voyage. A 40-foot container from Asia to Europe rose from about $1,500 to above $3,100, with peak spot spikes near 300%. Effective global shipping capacity fell around 9% as longer loops absorbed vessels. Each rerouted trip also generated about 38% more carbon emissions. Cost, delay, and emissions all moved together. March 2026 was worse, because Hormuz was hit during active Red Sea disruption. Military escalation among Iran, Israel, and the U.S. effectively closed the strait. War risk cover was rapidly withdrawn by maritime insurers. Routine premiums around 0.2% to 0.5% jumped to roughly 3% to 5%, with extreme quotes near 7.5%. Financing and insurance stress became as decisive as vessel availability. On a 20-foot Basmati container valued around $36,000, a 5% war premium adds about $1,800 before freight itself. Rates then doubled in many lanes, almost overnight. Industry estimates suggest between 2,000 and 25,000 crore rupees became trapped in unpaid invoices, frozen letters of credit, and demurrage accumulation. Liquidity froze, while cargo remained physically immobile. That is how a logistics shock becomes a balance sheet shock. Legal structures then started to fracture. The Indian Rice Exporters Federation sought an official force majeure declaration, but did not receive timely government relief. Exporters remained exposed to delivery penalties for disruptions outside their control. Contracting shifted from CIF to stricter FOB terms to move transit risk to buyers. Most Gulf buyers resisted those terms, and deal flow stalled. The fertilizer channel raised stakes further. Around 34% of global urea exports and 23% of ammonia originate in the Gulf region. Hormuz disruption, therefore, threatens next season planting economics, not just current cargo movement. A shipping blockage can become an agronomic shock with a delayed time profile. Today's freight freeze can lower next year's output. This market cannot diversify the way generic grains can. Under WTO TRIPS rules, geographical indications bind the Basmati name to specified regions in India and Pakistan. Retailers cannot legally source Basmati from Vietnam or Brazil when South Asian routes fail. The same legal logic protects Thai jasmine. Branding law and food security now intersect directly. That legal rigidity has already produced cross-border disputes. RiceTech in Texas secured a U.S. patent on Basmati rice lines and grains in 1997. India challenged it as biopiracy and succeeded in revoking key broad claims. It also passed the Geographical Indications of Goods Act in 1999. Today, India and Pakistan remain in EU IPO proceedings over exclusive Basmati GI control in Europe. Meanwhile, trade finance stress deepened inside normal operations. Basmati requires aging of roughly 3 to 24 months to develop aroma and grain elongation traits. That means exporters carry large inventories for long periods before sale. LT Foods reported 277 inventory days in fiscal 2025 and over 43 billion rupees tied up in aged paddy. Working capital pressure is structural, not episodic. Carrying costs are heavy even without disruption. Annual inventory carrying burdens run around 20% to 30% of inventory value. For an exporter holding $50 million in aged stock, a 6-month shutdown can destroy about $5 to $7.5 million before any shipment departs. Those losses are largely unrecoverable. Time itself becomes a cost center. Quality also decays while cargo waits. Heat raises fatty acid value, which correlates with rancidity. Grain strength weakens, fisher rates rise, and head rice yield declines. Once quality falls below premium specs, cargo is downgraded into lower tiers. That erodes margin and weakens collateral value for banks. Consumer effects vary sharply by country. The Philippines imported nearly 4.7 million metric tons in 2024, making it the largest rice importer. In late 2023, national rice inflation reached a 14-year high of 19.6%. Manila cut import tariffs from 35 to 15 to ease pressure, but pass-through to consumers was limited. Farmgate fancy dry palay prices fell by about 21.72%. Retail special premium rice fell only around 4.02%. The spread implies intermediaries captured most of the tariff relief. Policy intent reached supply chains, but not households in full. Nigeria faced a harsher transmission path. The naira moved from roughly 450 to over 1,600 per dollar. Estimated exchange rate pass-through was near 1.0, meaning devaluation hit consumers almost fully. Retail rice prices rose more than 150% from 2023 to 2024. For low-income households, this was not a substitution preference story. It was a forced substitution story. Historically, about 70% of household demand relied on imported long grain and local brown rice. As prices surged, families shifted toward yams and cassava, blended costly rice with cheaper domestic grades, or moved to the lowest-priced brown wet rice. Consumption adaptation happened, but nutritional quality and preference both fell. Currency instability became a food quality shock. Indonesia and Japan showed different transmission failures. Indonesian retail rice still rose about 2.93%, despite nearly 20% decline in the global rice price index by late 2025. Producer costs had risen around 7.97% as harvested dry grain prices moved from 5,000 to 6,500 rupiah per kilogram. Local cost pressure overrode global benchmark relief. Domestic transmission was broken in the opposite direction. Japan faced supply shock plus demand surge. Two poor harvests coincided with an additional 140,000 tons of consumption linked to tourism. After the August 2024 Nankai Trough earthquake warning, panic buying emptied shelves quickly. A standard 5-kilogram bag rose from 2,283 yen to 5,072 yen. That was a 220% increase in a high-income market. Three structural conclusions follow from this evidence. First, export bans create persistent blowback beyond their intended policy horizon. India's 2023 restrictions incentivized Pakistan to expand and pushed importers to seek alternatives. Second, concentration of Basmati demand in the Gulf makes maritime choke points true single points of failure. Third, kinetic threats plus currency volatility are rewriting contract law in practice. The Overland International North-South Transport Corridor is often cited as a fallback. In practice, it is not a full substitute when Hormuz is blocked, because cargo still needs access through Bandar Abbas. If vessels cannot enter that node, the corridor cannot replace maritime flow at required scale. Nominal diversification does not equal operational diversification. This distinction matters in crisis planning. Countermeasures that look intuitive are not always the best performers. Strategic buffer stocks stabilize prices but are expensive, from about $44 per metric ton in Bangladesh to around $95 in India. Supplier diversification sounds logical, but for GI-protected grains, it is legally constrained. The highest scoring options in multi-criteria assessments focus on corridor governance and contract redesign. Resilience has to be built where bottlenecks actually exist. Digital green lanes are one practical tool. They shift border compliance to electronic pre-clearance and reduce friction under stress. During COVID, SEFTA green corridors moved more than 600,000 trucks without interruption. Dynamic AI-driven pricing can complement this by updating contract economics as risk changes. Better corridor logic plus better contracting can reduce freeze risk. Protected shipping corridors can also work when politically supported. The Black Sea Grain Initiative moved over 33 million tons despite active conflict pressure. The Unity Facility, linking insurers with Ukrainian state banks and Germany's DZ Bank, cut commercial war risk insurance costs by roughly half. Those examples show that finance design can restore movement even when baseline risk remains high. The key is coordinated public-private architecture, not isolated tools. The final reality is uncomfortable. Moving rice to consumers is now often harder than growing it. Until pressure in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf eases, reliable transit for premium rice remains uncertain. For now, the stranded tonnage is not a metaphor. It is inventory still waiting at sea. And as long as that remains true, the rice trap stays open. What makes this trap difficult to unwind is institutional fragmentation. Maritime security is managed in one arena, trade contracts in another, and humanitarian procurement in a third. Each system optimizes its own mandate rather than shared food continuity. That works in stable periods and fails under synchronized disruption. The 2026 shock showed that fragmented governance is itself a risk multiplier. Risk transfer also compounds silently through contracts. When insurers retreat, freight terms shift, and buyers resist new liability. Physical cargo can remain available, but commercially immobile. That is exactly what happened as CIF structures gave way to FOB pressure during the crisis window. In practice, market actors were negotiating legal exposure while vessels were already delayed. Timing mismatch between legal adaptation and corridor disruption turned friction into freeze. Humanitarian logistics then collides with the same bottlenecks. Aid agencies and commercial buyers compete for the same vessels, insurance capacity, and transit permissions during peak instability. If procurement cycles are rigid, humanitarian purchasing power erodes faster than needs can be recalculated. That is why delivery architecture matters as much as funding totals. Money without movement still leaves shelves empty. The Basmati case also has wider relevance. Any geographically protected staple with concentrated buyers and single-lane maritime dependence can face the same pattern. A corridor shock first appears as a freight event, then as a finance event, then as a nutrition event. By the time it reaches consumers, policy options are narrower and more expensive. Prevention, therefore, has to start upstream, before pricing panic begins. So, the strategic question is no longer whether these choke points are vulnerable. We have already seen the answer in repeated cycles. The real question is whether governments, traders, insurers, and aid systems can coordinate before the next closure, not after it. If they can, corridor shocks become manageable disruptions. If they cannot, maritime risk will keep rewriting who gets fed and who gets left behind.